Joe Biden holds back crucial armaments for Israel, saying enough is enough, and he wants Israel to hold back from a planned operation in Rafah. We will talk to Israel's foremost expert on Hamas, and it is Eurovision week. It's unholy. I'm Jonathan Friedland of The Guardian in London.
And I'm Yonit Levy of Channel 12 in Tel Aviv. Unholy Two Jews on the News. We have so much to go through, but do you want to begin with music? And I use that term loosely, Jonathan?
Well, normally this would be the little light opening, wouldn't it? We'd just have light banter about Eurovision Song Contest, bit of escapism. That would be before we plunge into all the heavy stuff of A Nation at War. But of course, Eurovision is not, untouched by everything going on. I've always been quite into Eurovision, partly because, there's the songs and the kitsch, we all know about that. But it is always just fascinating seeing all these different countries reveal their likes and dislikes, their alliances and preferences. That's all part of it. The voting has always been amazing. And it's always been quite a good indicator of how Israel is seen in the world. And the obvious example, and I was present in Jerusalem when it happened, long story, but I was there even actually for the rehearsal of Eurovision in 1979 when Galeatari won with Hallelujah, etc. And Israel won 2 years running. And that was the same week in 79 where the final, signature had been put on the Camp David Accords. Everyone couldn't get enough of Israel, right? Then 2 year winners in successive contests. And then you fast forward to the late 90s, and it's true that Netanyahu was prime minister, but Dana International won. And it was in that period, the 90s, when basically people bought the idea that Israel was trying to make peace with its neighbors and all was going well. Netta won in 2018. Can't put an immediate narrative on that, but, irresistible song and singer, and all part of that idea of Israel as a sort of gay-friendly place that was very, in step with modern mood. And so you can sort of check those boxes. You move to 2024, and I can honestly be, I'll come clean with you on it. I have not yet even heard the song, but I'm prepared to stake everything I have on saying Israel will not be the winner this year. As you and I speak, we don't even know if they'll be in the final. It is partly politics. They could have come up with, a cross between yesterday and Here Comes the Sun, and they would still lose because it's not the year for them, is how I am, recklessly predicting Saturday will go.
I have so much to say about what you just talked about. My first image that I can't get out of my head is you sitting with your caramel popcorn and your leggings and looking and listening and following closely the Eurovision, which I've now realized you're a pretty intense fan of. I am more an ignoramus, but that was a nice trip down memory lane, and Israel's different songs that won. All very good songs. By the way, this year, I think, as much as I can judge, is a pretty good song. As you said, it's always an indication of how Israel sits with the rest of the world. So I think I don't want to spoil it for anyone. And of course, we're talking on a Thursday, so the second semifinal is not even started. But I don't think it's the year we win the Eurovision. You haven't listened, after all you said, you haven't listened to the Israeli song. So big eye roll from Tel Aviv to you, Mr. Friedland. But I think, again, It's a pretty good song. It's
Here are
Hurricane.
The votes of the Tel Aviv jury. It's a big eye roll coming from the Israeli national broadcaster. No, I do deserve the eye roll, but it shows you something because I absolutely called it. I've got to say, with the Netta song, I heard it once 2 or 3 weeks before, and I said, that is going to
Toy, we should say, I think, right? That was the name?
Toy, yeah. I mean, and just everything about it was a brilliantly catchy song, but also her and the whole persona. And I called it then. I said that will win, and it did. And this year, as I said, I don't even need to hear the song, but I will make amends and make sure I hear the song. It's called Hurricane, and it was the successor song to a song called October Rain, which was deemed by the European or EBU, the European Broadcasting Union, too political and in violation of the rules. There's all this stuff going on now about protests. The contest is held in Malmo in Sweden. Very big Muslim community there with feelings of running very high about the war. Scheduled for today, Thursday, is a big demonstration. But there have been protests within the auditorium for these rehearsals and semi-finals. One of the, Swedish performer coming on with a kind of keffiyeh, not quite wearing it as a regular scarf, but around his wrist or something. It's all going on. It's intensely political. And they don't really know, I think, the organisers, quite how to sort of brace for it. Because on the one hand, they say, we're not political. On the other, there is a free expression thing and protests are allowed. And I think they're walking a very fine line. And you have the Irish singer and others who've said Israel shouldn't even be allowed to take part. So this isn't just the usual, fest of kitsch and sequins in which you get to put politics to one side. It is instead politics by another means.
Yeah, and I think we should add to that the fact that the threats against the Israeli delegation is such that they are under very, very intense security. Detail, essentially, Israel telling other Israelis, don't travel to the Eurovision because of threats. I can tell you that our two correspondents, Elad Simchayov and Ohad Chemo, were in Malmo last month. They felt incredibly threatened by many of the protests that they were trying to cover for the mere fact of speaking in Hebrew. Some of the people they interviewed telling them, don't send Israelis here because that is dangerous for them. So it's a little bit more than the sort of keffiyehs or someone trying to protest. By the way, she was, I think, on stage, Eden Golan, the Israeli singer, and she was booed yesterday. I think it could be, hopefully not, but Israel is bracing itself for a very, intense security around the Israeli delegation. It's incredibly sad that we have arrived at this point. We can't just have a normal conversation about good music or the lack thereof. But, instead, this is where we are at this point.
No, you're right. It's absolutely a manifestation of the fact that things have changed for Israel. I put it in a way that I took no pleasure in saying that Israel has become a kind of leper among the nations. And this, I'm afraid, is another manifestation of it. So Eurovision is not the only example of what is meant to be a big party, but is instead a source of some anxiety. And I'm looking to the calendar for next week, Yoni, and there is another one of those occasions coming.
Yeah, and we're looking at Independence Day on Tuesday, Memorial Day for fallen soldiers and civilians killed in terror attacks on Monday. Everything is happening under the shadow of this war, Jonathan, as Israel looks at its forward to its 77th year. Celebrations very much muted. There's still a lot of criticism that the government decided to keep intact the main ceremony, which is the torch lighting ceremony at the heart of the Yom Ha'atzmaut celebrations, actually the event that sort of ends the Memorial Day and begins Independence Day, in which there are 12 torches, in fact, to symbolize Israel's 12 tribes, lit in this event. Usually a very happy event in which every speaker lights the torch and then says, Letiferet Medinat Israel, for the glory of the state of Israel. There have been many hostages returning from captivity being asked by the state of Israel to light a torch. Most of them said that they can't do it this year until the rest of the hostages will come home. This will be a very different ceremony. There won't be fireworks and won't be an audience. But again, the government deciding to keep the essential part of it intact. And
where do you? I'm just curious, Yoni, yourself. Where do you stand on that? In the sense of, do you think it's best to show that Israel will not be bowed and can still continue and defy its enemies? Or do you think, don't hand them the victory by changing things? Or do you think it's not the right year and actually all those things shouldn't have happened? I'm asking you because in a way I'm divided myself between those two thoughts.
I mean, I think it's a question. It is definitely a heartbreaking Independence Day. I'm hard pressed to think of Independence Day that was tougher in the history of this country. I think there are families, many families grieving, and many families awaiting any piece of news about their loved ones. This is definitely not a year to celebrate. Again, there will be an alternative ceremony to the torch lighting ceremony. It does illustrate just how difficult it is for many to, join in with these celebrations, you think, I looked up the data just this morning, Jonathan, and as I said in the eve, just before Independence Day, this is how we do it in Israel. There's Memorial Day, and that Memorial Day is for fallen soldiers and for the citizens killed in hostilities. And the data is there are 822 Israeli citizens murdered this year. All in all, since the beginning, the establishment of the State of Israel, there are 4,070. So that means that about a fifth of the Israelis murdered in terror attacks were murdered this year. It gives you some sort of idea, of course, to say nothing of 711 soldiers killed since October 7th and in the war in Gaza, just how terrible this year is. So to your question, I think it's a very, very difficult thing to accomplish, to say we will do the ceremony with slight changes and see if that works. I think that to many Israelis, that will be very difficult.
I don't have any problem understanding why this would be so hard for Israel this year, because, it's a big claim you make that the hardest Independence Day in a 75-year history. You think about a country that's fought 4 or 5 major wars. Why would this one be so difficult? And that is because of, I think, something very fundamental was shaken on October the 7th, which is that central to the idea of independence, which is the thing that is being celebrated, central to the idea of self-determination is self-defense. And this was particularly vital for Israel, the notion that Jews, who had been a people for 2 millennia who were unable to defend themselves, would at last have their own place which they could defend. And the notion that Israelis were left defenseless for many hours on that day, on October the 7th, when the army was not there and it hadn't yet got to them. And, we talked about it at the time, we've talked about it since, how that was a very kind of Jewish moment in the sense it was a pre-state, it was a pre-Israel sort of feeling of vulnerability. I think it's shaken something. So in other words, it's not just that Israelis are not in a party mood because there are still hostages, because there have been dark moments for Israel before. It's rather that the very notion of independence has been shaken by October 7th. If you build into independence the notion of self-protection, self-defense, that it was upset by what happened on that day.
There are 2 fundamental ethoses in the state of Israel, right? One is the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, are so important in this country. You serve, your children serve, your parents served. They will save you when the day comes and the moment comes. As you said, that has been catastrophically shattered on October 7th. And I'll add to that one more ethos in the Israeli society, which in a way, as we speak, is being shattered. And that is the issue of solidarity, right? The idea that you don't leave anyone in the battlefield behind. It doesn't happen in the battlefield, and metaphorically, it doesn't happen. Israelis grew up, I definitely grew up in the generation that said, you're stuck in a remote point in the Sahara Desert, you will call the foreign ministry and they will get you out. You're stuck when your plane is being abducted by terrorists, the military is going to get you out. Israel will go to the ends of the earth to save you. And now we are sitting, and as I speak, a 2-hour drive from here, 3-hour drive from here, if you're driving slowly, people are held in tunnels underground, and Israel cannot save them. And that is a shattering, thought. In a way, these people are tragically stuck in a terrible political battle between 2 camps. We talked about this a lot, right? The supporters of this government, the opponents of the government, one side saying to the other, you're trying to prevent us from fighting a war. The other side saying you're not doing the important thing, which is taking the hostages out. But in the meantime, the 132 hostages are slowly dying away. And I think that, in a sense, beyond what you're saying about the Israel defending itself and citizens knowing they'll be protected, that in itself is something so, shattering to the core of the Israeli character that I think that is also contributing to the general mood.
Yeah, absolutely. I think they're parts of the same thing. Mm-hmm. This notion there being a covenant between the state and its citizens. And, to put it very emotively, we will give you our children our 18-year-olds go into military service, as you said, and in return you will protect us in whatever form that takes. And, as you said, whether that means being on the tarmac in Entebbe in 1976 or now. And we know because for 5 years, the Gilad Shalit, one Israeli citizen in Gaza, a colossal number of prisoners released in order to bring his return.
One of them, Yahya Sinwar, by the way.
Right? Yes, indeed. And we can wonder about why he was allowed to just carry on for many, many years, unbothered by the long arm of Israel after that release. But the point is now, as you say, a number of 130 plus hostages, that's the official number, and being neglected. There was a poll, I think this week, that showed that the overwhelming number of Israelis, Jewish Israelis, when asked to choose what is your number one priority, said it is to get the hostages back rather than an operation in Rafah, for example. And that the percentages it was 50, it was in the mid 50s, and the percentages for whom it was a second priority was in the mid 30s. There's a clear Israeli consensus, but is the wrong word to talk about Israel. But the numbers who think that is the number one priority are far in excess of those who don't. And yet there is a government that is not acting as if that is its number one priority. And what is even more extraordinary, to this point you've been making about the understanding, the ethos, is there is a disbelief on the behalf of the citizens that their prime minister really, really wants to get those people back. And that is extraordinary as a change in the country. I can't imagine any other time where they'd have understood if there were difficulties, if there were obstacles. Of course, it's hard, but not believing that the prime minister truly wants them back because maybe it doesn't suit him politically. That is a shattering thing in itself. And yet I think that is what's going on in some of those poll numbers, is a basic distrust. Of course, he wants them back, but not if it costs him in this way and that way and the other way. It's one among many political calculations. That feels like a very, very big shift precisely because of the context, the historical sort of founding ethos that you describe.
Yeah, I mean, I think Israel took a very large step in the direction of Hamas. It agreed to the release of only 33 hostages in the first stage. It agreed to saying some sort of version of the end of the war. It did go many extra miles, in the United States back that up. But you are right about the fact that many Israelis think that in the prior months, the motivation of the prime minister wasn't the number one thing to do, is to get the hostages out. I don't think the mood has to be just so incredibly dire as we walk into Independence Day. I'll just note one thing, right? If I try to think of Israeli society on October 8th or 9th, or the weeks after this calamity fell upon us, and the fact that Israelis, ran to the scene, all of them, from all walks of life, and the soldiers and the reservists who enlisted to this war in Gaza were, religious and secular and settlers and leftists from Tel Aviv, and the Jews and Druze and anything you can think of, to say nothing, by the way, of Zaka, which is Israel's recovery and rescue organization, Charedim. Most of them are ultra-Orthodox who ran to the scene as well. When we are with our backs to the wall, we know how to come together, which is something we should remember, even as now, the political strife is at the extent that I, haven't seen for a very long time.
Yeah, and I think, again, we said that in the weeks after October 7th, that while the government may have failed, the people of the country stepped up in an amazing way. And I think we talked about that a lot at the time. This point about how big a priority it is obviously not just an abstract one, but front and center in this week, particularly because of the ceasefires that never were, these reports that were coming suggesting there was a ceasefire. That's partly what I mean, these spontaneous protests, people rushing onto the streets. When word came on Monday that Hamas had accepted a ceasefire, suddenly there was a huge onrush of people, Israelis going onto the streets as if to say to their government, make this deal. We want these hostages back. And yet, no deal. No deal has come. And that, I think, feeds into that notion that we've been discussing about to what extent is this really the key sacred priority of the government that they feel it should be. The other thing that has happened, obviously,
again, we just need to make the note that Israel did say yes to the framework that the mediators came up with, and then Hamas said yes to a different, not completely, but slightly different agreement. So that is where we are at this point. And as you said,
and we'll get into this with our guest, who we're going to be speaking to shortly. Before we do that, though, the other big news that's come is from Washington, and the American president there withholding the delivery of some 3,500 bombs, but also saying, essentially, we're not going to carry on arming if Israel makes the move for a major operation in Rafah. We obviously draw the distinction between the border crossing itself, and Rafah, the city. And I think major operation is understood as the latter. But that is a big change. I mean, it's been threatened, it's been implicit, it's been warned from Washington, but now it's turned into something concrete.
Yes, and this is not good news. Even if you think the war should end, the president of Israel's most important ally is essentially saying to the world, the rift between us is so deep that I'm using maximum pressure and pulling out a decision I haven't used before. As you said, this has been building up for a while. We saw leaks to the New York Times. We saw Lloyd Austin, Secretary of Defense, in front of Congress, but this obviously is the most extreme manifestation of it, saying that the president essentially saying that Israel administration will not support Israel, not provide offensive weapons if it launches an operation in the populated areas of Rafah. Now, as an Israeli, from the Israeli perspective, I think there are two things here that are worrying Israelis. One is, and we will get into this in our conversation with Michael Milshtein, if this is what the American president is saying, what incentive does Hamas have to say, I'm releasing Israeli hostages to end the war, if Hamas already listens to the American president and might think that this means the war is already ending? So that's one question. But I think the bigger question here is that enemies of Israel, Iran, Hezbollah, Iran's proxy, Hamas itself, are watching this and saying what to themselves? I mean, we know from Israeli intelligence that the one thing they watch is for that rift between Israel and the United States. And they think that Israel is weaker. And by the way, Israel is weaker if that rift grows bigger. What is Hezbollah saying to themselves? Is Hezbollah saying, wait a minute, now if we attack Israel, does Israel have enough weapons to attack back? So I think that is the sort of very dangerous place that we might be arriving at with this statement.
Yeah, I think they would be unwise to draw that conclusion, because the American support for Israel during that Iranian air attack, where that Saturday night, where 300 plus missiles and drones rained on Israel, and America was right there. I think it should be clear to them that the United States, and Biden in particular, do make a distinction. They are absolutely there for Israel in terms of Israel's security. They're just not there for this thing, meaning the Rafah operation. And they're trying, Washington, I think they've done it pretty clearly, to make that distinction. They're not abandoning Israel. I don't think they're really even abandoning this particular war in Gaza, because they have been saying, they understand the goal of rooting Hamas out of Rafah. They just think there are other ways to do it than a full-scale operation on an area that is already a civilian population center, but now is 5-6 times the size because of all the internally displaced refugees.
Again, you're right about the wording. The thing is, what is the message that the world is hearing? And I think the message the world is hearing is there is a rift, a very clear one, between the United States and Israel. That is bad news for Israel in every sense, even if what they mean is just, we mean the specific operation in the populated area of Rafah. And I think it's a question how a president who is clearly a staunch supporter of this country, right? We shouldn't forget, even if we're upset at this in any way, that he came here during the war. No American president has ever done this. That he met Israeli hostages released as if he was the Israeli prime minister. And there are more examples of aid, of ammunition thus far. But the question is, if he arrived at this point, is this now the starting point for a next American president? Also, I think another question, and again, we are in an election year in the United States. We already heard President Trump, saying Biden sides with Hamas and he's leading the world to World War III. Obviously, Trump is going to have a field day with this. But also, does this mean that in a way he set the course for two elections, one of them not yet declared in Israel, right? Because he set Netanyahu as being what he likes to be to his base, the leader standing alone in front of the rest of the world, including the United States. And did he give former President Trump a big gift in saying this as well? So there are a lot of ramifications to this.
Just first on your absolutely correct point that a rift between America and Israel is bad for Israel, but I'm bound to say, who opened up this rift? I mean, Netanyahu has been threatening this and playing with it and flirting with it and using it for years, ever since he went to Washington and spoke to the Congress against the Obama administration. He thinks this plays for him politically. For him now to be, shocked that there is gambling in a casino, for him to be appalled at the idea of a rift opening up with Washington, well, look in the mirror. It was you, Mr. Netanyahu, who started this rift and pushed Israel's most devoted ally in American politics, probably the president who is most pro-Israel instinctively ever, pushed him to this point. It seems to me that the choice that Netanyahu has faced, it could not now be any starker. And that choice has been for a long while. Who is more important to him, Joe Biden or Itamar Ben-Gvir? Those are the two poles here. And Biden has said to him, I need you to do this. And Ben-Gvir has said, which meaning holding back from Rafah. And Ben-Gvir and Smotrich say, you've got to go all in and just keep going. And he has tried to keep them both happy, to walk this line. But now it seems as if time is running out for that classic Bibi strategy of just delay and delay and delay and kicking the can down the road. He now has to choose who is more important to him. My fear is that Ben-Gvir holds his coalition and therefore his political fortunes and even his personal fortunes, staying out of jail, in his hands. And therefore he will not alienate Itamar Ben-Gvir, even at the expense of an American president cutting off like this. Of course, Biden has to do this, is what I think, because he has to show that he means what he says. We heard from Mike Murphy, David Axelrod, when they were on the podcast. The big central narrative for Donald Trump is that Joe Biden is weak. That's what he says. And Donald Trump, am strong. Biden has to prove that he's not weak and that he has his own credibility is on the line. He's been saying to Israel, don't do this. He cannot afford to be defied. And again, it was what Mike Murphy said, the Republican sage on our podcast, said, beware a cornered president in a re-election year. And Netanyahu cornered him. He pushed him into this corner. Biden cannot risk this war getting worse and more civilians dying when he has a big part of his base, the young, the progressives. We're seeing them on the America's campuses calling him Genocide Joe. He cannot let this thing go on much longer. And Netanyahu needed to, work around that. Instead, he has pushed and pushed and pushed until we've come to this moment.
I think it might be a little bit more complicated in the sense that you say it's either Ben-Gvir or Biden. And of course, because Ben-Gvir holds the coalition in his hands, he's obviously going to choose Ben-Gvir in parentheses, incredibly mature reaction by the Minister of National Security to what Joe Biden, the President of the United States, has said to CNN. I'm sure that using emojis will definitely make Biden change his mind. But end parentheses.
What was Ben-Gvir's reaction?
Oh, he wrote Hamas heart Biden.
Nice.
So what I was trying to say, I think that Netanyahu is now very concerned about the international community and the United States. Things like the ICC, the International Criminal Court, maybe issuing an arrest warrant personally against him is something he is deeply concerned about. So I'm not sure it's only the Ben-Gvir side of this equation that is winning. And at the end of the day, the perennial problem here, right? Remember, there are some moderate, serious parts of this coalition. But the perennial problem here is, what is Israel's strategy? You want to go into the corridor of Rafah to prevent smuggling because that's important? Fine. But you're letting Hamas back into the northern part of the Strip. I mean, this is the one question. If what you're busy doing and what Netanyahu does better than most, which is kicking the can down the road and not deciding for a very long time if it's Rafah or the hostages, or if it's, Rafah or Riyadh, in the words of Thomas Friedman. The thing that he's actually doing here is not sitting down and thinking of a strategy for the war, a strategy for the day after the war. And I think that is the biggest problem that Israel has at this moment.
Which is probably the right moment to hear from resident sage on this whole question, the man who follows Hamas more closely, I would suggest, than perhaps anybody else, certainly in Israel. And he's our guest this week.
Dr. Michael Milshtein is the head of the Palestinian Studies Forum at the Moshe Dayan Center at Tel Aviv University. In the past, he served as the advisor on Palestinian affairs for the coordinator of government activities in the territories, and is one of Israel's top experts on Hamas and the Palestinian arena, and a friend of the pod. Michael, thank you so much for joining us again. We're always happy when you're on.
Thank you for having me, Yonit and Jonathan.
There's so much to go through, but I will want to open up with President Biden's statement. And I'm wondering what Hamas is hearing in that statement, and most specifically, why would they now make concessions towards a hostage deal if what they're hearing, indeed if this is what they're hearing in the president's words, is the war is essentially over?
Well, Yonit, we will speak later about the whole issue of Rafah and the importance of this operation today. And I must admit that I'm quite critic against the Israeli military entrance to Rafah. I mean the urban, the populated area itself. And I have a lot of reservations about the Israeli policy. But on the same time, basically, I consider Biden's announcement yesterday as another change in a long history of mistakes of the American diplomacy regarding the Middle East. I do consider this kind of announcement actually of embarrassing publicly allies and causing them even a damage to their image. I do think that actually it's a reflection of lack of understanding the nature of conflicts and even the nature of the actors here in the Middle East. I do believe once again that there should be a discourse, even a very tough discourse, but you should understand that when you have such an announcement, you really cause satisfaction to the enemies, or actually the whole radical groups in the area. So I do wish, and this is my hope, that the American administration, which there is no doubt about his willingness and about his loyalty to the defense of Israel, will have some clarifications about his deep intentions. So there will be no strategic damage to Israel, and that we will not see any kind of defiance of Israel's enemies like Iran, like Hezbollah, of course, like Hamas, that will express the fact that they do think that there is a rift between Washington and Jerusalem, and that Israel is actually weaker.
Mm-hmm.
But to Yonit's point, I mean, do you think they will be encouraged by this? They'll think these allies are now turning on each other. Israel no longer has America's backing. Therefore, we just need to wait this out. We have no reason to compromise as a result of this statement.
Yeah, regarding Hezbollah, Jonathan, I do think, they are very calculated, but they're going to be very satisfied and maybe promote more, let's call it, defiant steps against Israel. I mean, in the ongoing attrition, in the ongoing escalation in the north. Regarding Hamas, it's more complicated because I do think that basically, and of course we will speak about it later, basically Hamas wish to promote this ceasefire, this agreement. So I think that, of course, it's going to cause them a lot of happiness and even hopes that Israel is more flexible and Israel is even weaker. But I don't think that they're going, for example, right now, leave the negotiations and say, okay, we're closing the doors. And right now, we believe that Israel has no strategic back. and we can continue with this war forever. No, they do want this the end of the war. They can maybe be more tough in their conditions regarding the end of the war or the demands from all the sides regarding the final agreement about the war.
So let's rewind a little bit to Monday this week, when Hamas, I'll say, pulled a Bibi on Bibi and let a declaration out a few minutes before primetime television at 8 o'clock in Israel, and said essentially that they're agreeing to an Egyptian framework for a ceasefire. The Israeli government saying that document is not something we agreed on. So let's talk about the chances as we sit here Thursday afternoon. What are the chances that this deal can actually happen?
We all know that this is a big question mark in Israel, in the Israeli discourse, regarding the question, does Hamas really want any kind of agreement? And I must admit, and this is my opinion, my personal opinion, that during several months, Hamas really wished to have an agreement that will put an end to the war, but in its own conditions. And I think that Yahya Sinwar feels during the several last weeks that these conditions were implemented. And when you're checking Yahya Sinwar's principles and demands, you see that there are two demands which are very tough, and he's very strict regarding them. And actually, they both reflect his basic deep will to return to the same situation that took place on October the 6th, and actually to demonstrate the whole world that he survived. The first one is the permit to all the refugees from the south, from the southern parts of Gaza, to return to their homes in the north. And the second one is a full withdrawal of IDF forces from every territory in Gaza Strip. There is another point, but here I think that Yahya Sinwar is more flexible. And this is the demand that Israel will announce that the war is over, that, Israel will not renew the war. And I must, I read almost not almost, 5 times a day, Hamas announcement and Hamas, the interviews with Hamas supreme members. And, I do recognize that they're ready to be more flexible regarding this sentence or this saying. It means that if you will, for example, promote a cosmetic change in the definition of this principle, maybe Hamas will accept it. By the way, it's quite ironic, but it's very similar to the basic terms and the basic definition of Hamas itself of the term hudna. Hudna, It's not a ceasefire. It's not a peace. It's a temporary ceasefire,
cessation of violence,
which means that you have the time to strengthen yourself until you will surprise your enemy and will bring his end. And, it's quite amazing because when you check, for example, how important for Hamas is the question of releasing all the prisoners from Israeli jail, you see that seemingly it was the raison d'etre of this war. But apparently, it seems that it's the less important demand of Hamas, and they're ready to be very flexible regarding the number and regarding, the level of the prisoners. This all shows us that this war was never about prisoners, was never about releasing them from Israeli jail, but it was with much deeper meaning, promoting the jihad and undermining the basic layers of Israel.
You saying what this war was really about, it reminds me of the conversation we had on the podcast with the Gazan-born US writer Ahmed Fouad al-Khatib, who asked exactly this question: what was this about? Given what you said at the beginning there, Michael, which is that the big aim of Sinwar, the man in charge in Gaza, is to restore the status quo ante, in other words, the situation on October the 6th.
Yes.
And what Ahmed Fouad al-Khatib said is, we have lost all these people, taken all this life and seen all this devastation just so we could go back to the situation we already had. It'd be interesting to hear what you think about that.
Yeah.
But the second point I wanted really to follow up on what you said about the difference between the two sides. Does it then, given what you said, come down to that last issue, which is the Hamas demand that Israel say it's over and we're not coming back, and Netanyahu's desire to say we retain the right to go back in as soon as this deal is done and we've got our hostages back, the war goes on. Is that, as far as you're concerned, the gap between the document that Hamas said we've agreed with on Monday and the document that Israel said it agreed with and that Blinken and Biden and the others were saying was the most generous offer? Yeah. Is that the gap?
Well, regarding the first question, Jonathan, I basically believe or feel that sometimes when we elaborate the question of what were Yihya Sinwar's targets, it reflects the fact that we still don't understand him. We're speaking about ideological leader, and we are trying to analyze his moves with realpolitik, Western-style methods. And, when you're checking really deeply the discourse of Hamas, I mean the public and the political discourse, you really understand that his basic goals were quite, let's call it ideological. He knew on October the 7th that he's not going to defeat Israel. It will not be, the day that Israel will eradicate from the map. He's very realistic, although he's very religious, radical religious leader. But he wanted to undermine the basic layers of the Israeli society. He wanted to create alienation between the society and the regime and between groups inside the society. And he also wanted to create hostility between Israelis and Palestinians, so there will be no chance to speak about any kind of coexistence or peace or two-state solutions. And, I do assess that in several of these goals, he actually succeeded. And, when we're speaking about all kind of attempts to undermine the normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel, or to even to improve the economic situation in Gaza, or to release all the prisoners, I consider all these topics as excuses, not reasons. The reason is very deep, and the reason is the jihad against Israel. And, Yihya Sinwar, in his mind, he acts according to a different dimension of time. He thinks that, he's maybe one of the first stages in a long voyage to eradicate Israel from the map, and maybe he will die, and maybe he will be killed during this jihad, and maybe the final stage of eradicating Israel from the map will be implemented within 100 years. But, they say Allah is with the sabirin, with those who are patient. So regarding the question of the definition of the announcement about ending the war, I assess, this is my personal assessment, that there could be a compromise, a formula that will satisfy both Israel and Hamas. Which, the deep meaning of this formula from Hamas point of view will be the end of the war. And from Israel point of view, that the gates of the next steps are still open. But from Yihya Sinwar's, his personal opinion, the most important things are the concrete one, are the withdrawal of IDF forces and the return of the population of Gaza City to the places they live in. And any other, symbolic, verbal issues, they are important, but not so important as the concrete steps.
The fact that we're sitting here 7 months into the war and still talking about what Sinwar wants and how Sinwar is trying to get it sort of answers my next question. But it is, how close is Israel now to achieving this country's main goal in the war, which is toppling Hamas's rule in the Gaza Strip and eradicating Hamas's threat to us?
And I agree, Yonit, actually Israel announced on the evening of October the 7th that this is the basic strategic goal of the war. And, here once again, I do think that we should be more frank and more realistic, and must admit that we're not so close to the implementation of this target. You are analyzing the situation today in Gaza. And as you mentioned, correct, Yihya Sinwar, 7 months after this great war he opened by surprise, is still alive. And more than that, Hamas is still the dominant actor in Gaza. There is no alternative for Hamas, even in the northern parts of Gaza, where IDF committed ground maneuver and seemingly ruined all Hamas military and governmental infrastructure. Right now, Hamas is still the one who really pushes the red buttons over there. And we must also admit that, I think it was 3 or 4 months ago, we declared about the third phase strategy. All kind of surgical or limited operations in order gradually to undermine the stability of Hamas. And we must admit that it was this kind of strategy was failed because Hamas is still the prominent power. And, I think that all those arguments bring us, or should bring us, the Israelis, to the conclusion that if you really want to change dramatically the situation in Gaza, you must take control over all this territory, over all Gaza Strip, and stay for a while over there in order to create a new alternative. Because otherwise, there will be no magics. Hamas is not going to leave Gaza and is not going to leave the achievements, the historic achievements of having a regime in Gaza. And I must admit that it seems to me that right now, Israel doesn't have the capacity and not even the willingness to commit such a dramatic step. I mean, taking control over all Gaza.
Just explain to us, to bring it to the current sort of flashpoint that has happened with the American administration, and that is about Rafah specifically. The New York Times columnist Tom Friedman, it's presumed channeling the views of the Biden administration itself, so that Israel now faces this choice. He put it very memorably as Rafah versus Riyadh. Either you go into Rafah and anger the Americans or you don't, and then there is this path towards normalization with Saudi Arabia. Looking at what's happened in the last few days, although, you may say it's not what it seems, and that will be interesting, but it does seem as if Netanyahu has made his choice and decided that Rafah is tremendously important. And that's indeed what prompted Biden to play this last card and sort of try and stop him. But just explain to us why it is that going into Rafah is so important that it's worth jeopardizing, even sacrificing this potential opening to normal relations with Saudi Arabia. And I just want to qualify that by saying it can't be just because that's where we now think Sinwar and the rest of Hamas are, because as you've explained, they sort of pop up somewhere else.
That's right.
Anyway, each time Israel's done this in the north or in Khan Yunis, Israel holds it for a few minutes and then Hamas pop back up again. I'm being simplistic, but you know what I mean? Sure. So why is Rafah so important?
I assess that if you really want to change the situation in Gaza, you must control Rafah. But when we are saying Rafah, the meaning is not the city itself, but the borderline, what we call in Hebrew the Philadelphia corridor between Kerem Shalom and the shore of Rafah, which is really the gate between Gaza and Sinai, actually Gaza and the world. And, when you're thinking about all the measures that was used by Hamas in order to turn from a terror or guerrilla organization to quasi-army, so it was this area, the borderline of Philadelphia. And I do think that, it's even a strategic goal from Israeli point of view to take control over this strip, this corridor. But, and this is my opinion, I don't think that committing ground maneuver into the city of Rafah, which is right now, before October the 7th, it was approximately 200,000 people living over there. Today we are speaking about almost 1 million because all the refugees from the north got to this place. And there are, for El-Qassam, the military wing of Hamas brigades, which are still active in this area. And I think that it is wrong to describe the city itself and the 4 battalions of Hamas as the last stations that was left for Israel in order to be very close to the total victory. I do assess that even if Israel will get into Rafah, will destroy the military infrastructure of Hamas in Rafah, will defeat the 4 battalions of Hamas in Rafah, Hamas will still exist. And that's why I think that if Netanyahu want to be portrayed as just and very focused in his moves, he should explain that the meaning or his aim is not to get into Rafah, to the populated urban areas of Rafah, but to be focused on the corridor of Philadelphia. And the basic meaning or the deep meaning is that you should also stay in this place, or at least make sure that other actor different from Hamas will stay over there, because otherwise it will be like in the northern parts of Gaza. It means that when you will leave this place, immediately Hamas will return to them, and this vacuum will be once again will be filled only by Hamas, not by any other alternative.
So let's talk about that. Like, what is the exit strategy? What is to be done? Whatever mistakes Israel made from the beginning of the war to this point, however strong Sinwar still is, what can be done? Because at the end of the day, it's obvious that Israel can't live with this kind of threat on its southern border. And I assume you will say that a lot of the ideas that have been floating around are pipe dreams, right? Let's bring in the Saudis and hope everything will be okay. On the other hand, obviously, Israel doesn't have the international credit to now say, you know what, I'm going to occupy Gaza just for a year until we figure out who's the next alternative Palestinian power. What should Israel be doing now to try and, somehow draw this roadmap for an exit strategy?
Well, actually, Yonit, you described, the basic dilemma, strategic one of Israel, and the dilemma that actually needs a very clear, even a painful decision from Israel, not, all kind of slogans and general sayings about a total victory and ongoing long-term war. I do, and this is my personal view, I think that Israel arrived not lately, but during the last 3 or 4 months to a T-junction, strategic T-junction, and there are only 2 options. The first one, as you said, and I agree with you, is to take control over all Gaza. Right now, with between 3 to 4 brigades, you cannot commit this goal in Gaza. And it seems that you don't really have any willingness to promote this goal, because you have other problems like the northern arena and the clashes with Iran. And it means that you have to consider in a more serious manner the other option. The other option is the deal, a broad one regarding the hostages. And this deal is a painful deal. I mean, all the hostages should be released from Hamas' hands, but the deep meaning is that Israel, it seems, that must withdraw from all Gaza and also halt, at least by now, the war. And I do think that right now, since we have no other choice, the third phase is a failure, and you don't really want or can promote full control over Gaza. So you have no other choice. You need to choose the least worst scenario, and this is the deal. Mm-hmm. And this is my assessment, or even wishful thinking. Israel actually was surprised by the current war, and all these strategic moves that are being promoted right now are not very, there are not a lot of days or weeks of planning behind them, and there are no plans at all for the day after Hamas or how to occupy Gaza. So let's stop. Let's return to the discussion rooms. Let's think about plans. Let's, in the future, in the coming years maybe, be the player that will initiate moves, not the one who will be surprised. And so right now, I do assess that although it's full of challenges and it's full of problems, it's better for Israel to promote the deal and to return to crystallize much deeper strategy regarding the future.
In other words, end this war and lay the groundwork for the next war with Hamas. That's essentially
right.
What you're saying. That's
right, Yonit. And it's very sad and once again very painful for us as Israelis to say that because it actually demonstrates that it was not such a successful war for a lot of strategic achievements. A lot of Israeli soldiers were killed during this war. But it seems that right now, as we have no other solutions, and we don't really want to be dependent on all kind of general slogans like the total victory, so I think that it's much better to be focused on the deal.
But that scenario you've just sketched out means leaving Hamas de facto in charge of Gaza as they were before. You know, you said that would be hard for Israelis to take. That would mean for the Prime Minister, Netanyahu, to admit that this war of 7 months had achieved nothing. It was still the same state that we were in on October the 7th. I don't see the world in which he can admit that. And therefore, we've often said, the commentary has often said, he really needs politically for this war to continue. That's we've been said and debated. Your expertise is particularly in Hamas. You listen to them, you watch what they're doing. Can the same be said for Sinwar? In other words, this need for his own position, for the war to continue, you know, despite what you said about how he plays on a different timeline in thinking in centuries and so on. Does he need this war to continue for his own position, or maybe based on what you said before, just the war ending and him still alive counts as a massive victory?
Yeah, you know, it's a very, very important issue, Jonathan, because, you know, we're getting deep into his logic and into the way that he commits strategic balance after these 7 months of war. And, you know, I assess, this is my assessment, that basically he think that he achieved a lot of positive developments. Let's call it that during this war. Of course, there were, you know, unprecedented number of casualties and unprecedented destruction in Gaza. And, you know, he's quite disappointed from other players like the West Bank and the Arab sector in Israel and also Hezbollah. But, you know, he says to himself, in the end of the day, first of all, I survived personally, but also as a political entity. And, you know, this war will end. And I will actually look at the next phases or the next stations for Hamas, basically issues like the day after Abu Mazen or maybe elections in the future. This is not the end of Hamas. So from his point of view, it's time to actually stop the war. Mm-hmm. He doesn't really have any problem if this war will continue. According the theory or the philosophy of resistance, mukawama, they don't have any problem. You know, even if you will cause 100,000 casualties among the Palestinians, it's okay with him as long as you didn't achieve your goals in the war. This is the greatest achievement of Hamas. And, you know, I think that if you could ask him 7 months ago, where and how you see yourself, and you would tell him that the current situation is the scenario, he would tell you that this is quite okay. This is even very good scenario. You know, still to be the prominent power in Gaza. IDF is not has almost no presence in Gaza, and there is no alternatives, and even no self-criticism or internal protest against Hamas. I'm quite sure that his strategic balance from his point of view is quite positive.
I'm going to ask you probably the toughest question yet, Michael, but give us something to be optimistic about. I mean, obviously the situation is different than what Israelis hoped or even thought it would be 7 months ago when this war started at this point. But is there something that we can look at and feel optimistic about? Is, I don't know, Saudi normalization, the silver bullet everyone is talking about? What is the sort of thing that we can cling on to and say, okay, we can be proud about this achievement?
Yeah, you know, I'm trying, you need to be optimistic, but also realistic, because it's very important in the Middle East. Sometimes people are so much trying to be optimistic that they're forgetting to be more realistic. And, you know, and once again, as I usually say, I do wish that I do not mix between wishful thinking and assessments. I do feel that the Israeli public understood from October the 7th that you need to have decisions, strategic one, historic one regarding the Palestinian arena. You cannot, manage the conflict forever or shrinking the conflict. You need decisions. And, my basic hope, and it's quite optimistic one, is that in the next elections, and I don't know when they will take place, the Israeli public, which I think sometimes is more clever than his leadership, will demand from any candidate to explain exactly, not by general slogans, how he's going to promote not a solution, but a settlement for the Palestinian arena in Gaza Strip, but also in the West Bank. And it's going to be a very tough discourse, but it's an existential need for Israel to decide about things. For example, buffer zones between us and Palestinians, because I think my conclusion from October the 7th is that the two peoples cannot live in one entity, in what we call in Israel, Medina Achat, from the river to the sea, because it's going to be more like a Bosnian hell. So once again, I don't have a lot of optimistic points and optimistic arguments, but I do hope that becoming more realistic, it's quite a positive issue for the Israelis. So I only hope that they will try to promote and to implement this conclusion and to turn it into a policy.
Well, we hope that would be some kind of progress. If
That's
the
as close to
politicians
optimism as we'll get in this conversation.
That is as close. But yeah, if the politicians actually are forced to address the long-term questions, that would be progress of some kind. But that was a bit of a sobering reality check, Michael, but very good to hear it from you. And thanks once again for sharing all that thought and insight with us on Unholy.
Thank you. And let's hope that our next meeting will be much more optimistic and maybe much more boring.
We're keeping our fingers crossed for that.
2075.
Something like that. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Michael.
It's always very, very much worth your while listening to Michael Milshtein. As he made clear, he is monitoring Hamas's own internal conversation on different platforms and really hearing what they're saying to each other. I thought the really standout thing there was this sober assessment from him that Hamas have succeeded in many of their aims. Sinwar wanted to alienate Israelis from their government and whole communities from the state, and he felt they'd done that. And I would add to that, Israel from the rest of the world. I don't know to what extent that was an aim of Sinwar's, to drive a wedge between Israel and world opinion, but it certainly seems as if they've achieved that. So to hear that coming from him, who is the number one expert on that organization, I thought was pretty sobering.
Yeah, and I think that what he said at the very end, right, to say, listen, I'm paraphrasing, cut your losses, stop this war, realize that you can't have total victory right now, he says to Israel, and then prepare for your next round, because this is far from over. It's very tough to hear as an Israeli, knowing how many victims have been murdered by Hamas, knowing how many soldiers have died in this war. But I think it's important to listen to really someone who is such an expert on Hamas and was warning about the dangers before October 7th, to listen to what he has to say.
Yeah, really, really valuable. I mean, it could be, maybe this is me being overly optimistic. He said preparing for the next, he did say you've got to prepare for something else and regroup. That it doesn't have to necessarily be a war. There could be another way of doing this, but it requires strategy and planning and working out how Israel is going to live alongside Gaza and the Palestinians. And that doesn't necessarily have to be solved that way. There are other ways to do that, but that is a whole other conversation. We should hand out our awards as tradition demands. I can't make a link between this and our usual subjects, but I just couldn't resist, I'm afraid, which is the governor of South Dakota, Kristi Noem, who has out an autobiography. There were questions asked about the claim she made, which she describes very, with color, of meeting the North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un. It's come to light that she never did meet Kim Jong-un. And she's been asked about that, even though the book says, when I met him, he knew he couldn't mess with me, etc. She said, I'm not going to talk about specific meetings with world leaders. I'm just not going to do that. This anecdote shouldn't have been in the book. And as soon as it was brought to my attention, I made sure that that was adjusted. Now, let's just pause for a moment. If anybody's ever written a book, you know that you don't need lines in the book brought to your attention because you wrote it. And there's been video circulating of her recording the audiobook in which she reads out loud this sentence that supposedly she wrote. And therefore, it should really not have been needed for someone to draw it to her attention. Her defense is essentially, this book, not only perhaps did I not write it, I didn't read it. I don't know what's in it. Somebody else made up a whole attack,
but she did say thank you.
Kim Jong-un.
She did say thank you for bringing it to my attention. So I think that's okay.
I think it's just marvelous. I mean, if ever you want to wound me deeply, Yonit, you'll bring a line of one of my own books to my attention, and I will say, well, now that I'm aware of that, I must, of course, make adjustments. Adjustments have been made. Notice I made sure that was adjusted. Fantastic. Chutzpah from would-be Nobel laureate in literature, Christine
maybe not
South
this year.
Dakota.
Maybe not just yet.
Yeah, maybe not just yet.
But to some Unholy trivia, when was the last time the name Kim Jong-un was mentioned on Unholy?
Well, I can tell you the first time. I'm going to say it was when we first celebrated Purim on this podcast, and I revealed that my son Jacob he didn't do it regularly, but he did once go to his Jewish school on Purim dressed as Kim Jong-un. And the difficulty of living in diaspora, as we noted then, is that not everyone else is celebrating Purim. So they just noticed a kid on the London Underground dressed as a North Korean dictator and thought, weird.
Weird
That's
kid.
what happened there.
He wasn't a weird kid. He was just dressed for Purim. Still, after 3.5 years, my favorite unholy story. So are we moving on to the mensch category? We can't leave home without it. Actually, two, if it's okay. I think one mensch award, well-deserved for the Jewish students of Columbia. One of the signatories on the letter that we will talk about in a second is Noah Fay, who was our guest last unholy episode. This is a letter that they write, and good for them for standing up for themselves, basically defending their support for Israel and decrying the harassment that they faced in the school. More and more signatories are added to this letter as we speak, and I think it's really important for them to write this letter, to stand up for themselves. They really do deserve the Mensch Award this week, don't you think?
Yeah, I do. And I think it's written very forcefully. And I liked the fact they've called it In My Name, because, of course, one of the great slogans is Not In My Name. Right. And so they've done that. And it has, I don't know about going viral, but I know that at least a dozen different people sent it to me on Wednesday night when I think it first surfaced, all excited by it. And it has been one of those things that's articulated what a lot of people have been feeling. But yeah, I think given where they are and the mood where they are, I think it would have taken some courage to do that. So an award on its way to the signatories of that letter.
But we do have one more suggestion for the Mensch Awards. I mean, we were giving it to them, but we had one more that we wanted to mention
go on.
This week, which is Sophia Ram. She is a French comedian, and she's Muslim. She stood up at the Molière Awards. I think they were yesterday. We're talking on Thursday. This week, she stood up and she basically said that the people who are protesting Israel's actions in Gaza cannot be silent when they look at or think about the massacre of 1,200 Israeli civilians. And how can you, she said, demand from Israel a ceasefire without demanding the release of the hostages? This is a text that is so important that she said it on stage. We should add, again, as I said, she's Muslim. Her husband is Christian. He's the one who writes with her and collaborates with her. I think my friend, good friend Shiri, told me that they actually decided to call their son, because they couldn't decide between Pierre and Muhammad, they decided to call their son Chaim, which is a very interesting trivia point here. But I think it's really, it's a beautiful thing, what she said and what she tried to say to the world in this message.
I thought so too, and it was to get out of a kind of very sort of French entertainment audience, a sort of showbiz audience, a big, warm, long round of applause to this point that really, essentially, you should be able to care about both Palestinian suffering and the hostage families. And coming from her, as you said, a French Muslim woman, I agree that has great resonance. So I think perhaps sharing the honours in the Mensch category this week. We always ask and encourage you to spread the word, as so many of you are doing. Have to say, lots of emails have been coming in recent weeks describing Unholy as a lifeline in these times, and we appreciate those very much indeed. So we are grateful.
He never forwards me those emails. Jonathan, forward me those emails.
Almost always forward them to you. What will people think? Of course, I forward them to you. And we are very glad to hear from you.
We are indeed, and we will say our thank yous to Gaia Glazer, Omer Primat, Omri Barak, and we shall meet next week, Jonathan.
See you then.